Give us a sense of where you are with Omicron, with the virus overall. When do you think you're going to be back all the way?
Well, look, as we've seen over the last 2 years, there are a lot of ups and downs as you go through the different waves of COVID, and Omicron was just the latest. And it certainly impacted the fourth quarter. It's having an impact here in January on our business. But the trend has been pretty consistent that we're getting better and better as a society at dealing with COVID, at having it become endemic. And even as we look out, at March bookings, for example, they're on pace with where they were in the pre-COVID era. So this has been a temporary setback, but we feel like we've set the foundation to have United become the leading global airline on the other side of this crisis. And the short-term variations with Omicron really don't change the long-term at all.
So, Scott, my understanding from having seen you talk other places is that you are expecting less capacity than you otherwise would have at this point. But I want to ask about one other thing, which is the delays in the Boeing 787. Is that affecting your business as well as Omicron?
Yeah, so one, we're making the conscious decision right now because demand is lower to fly fewer airplanes. It's pointless to put airplanes in the sky, burn fuel, and waste money when demand is lower. But there are two other big impacts. The biggest one for us is our Pratt & Whitney 777s, which we have 52 wide-body airplanes that have been grounded for almost a year now. We expect them to start flying again later this quarter. There is some impact of the 787 delays, but it's not as big as the first two, and we expect to start taking those later in the year.
We're all talking about inflation an awful lot right now, Scott. What's it doing to your costs, and particularly labor costs?
Well, we see inflation more in our vendor expenses than in the direct costs at United Airlines. We planned for high inflation, and we are absolutely seeing high inflation right now. But we've been planning for this. The real struggle has really been for aviation. All the support infrastructure, whether it's aircraft fuelers or if you go to the airport, a lot of times restaurants are closed, and getting all the people, wheelchair service, getting all the people to support all the infrastructure around aviation has been a challenge. At United Airlines, we don't really have a big challenge hiring for United, but all the support services is where we've seen the challenge and the big inflation.
One of the things we're hearing an awful lot about right now is 5G, this spectrum that they're opening up to 5G. Everybody seems to agree we need 5G, but there's a question about possible interference with some of the avionics of particularly the altimeters, as I understand it, of airliners. I must say, those of us on the outside have a tough time sorting all this out about exactly what happened, why it happened, and we get conflicting reports. I talked to Paul Jacobs, the former head of Qualcomm yesterday, now head of ESCOM, and he said actually the airlines should have invested some money to avoid it. This is what he had to say.
On the 5G airplane thing, I mean, the issue is that the airlines they didn't do anything about it. I mean, if you look at the difference between what happened with the broadcasters and the airlines, the broadcasters, when they got moved, they invested. The airlines didn't do anything.
So does he have a point? Does he have a point that the airlines could invest some money and get themselves out of this jam?
Well, look, I think he is probably, look, he comes from telecom, so he's probably missing the biggest point. I think the biggest and best news is this has been done in 40 countries around the world. Done successfully. There are limitations around airport runways in all 40 of those countries about power levels, antenna direction, and what can happen with towers. But it all works well. They've rolled out the towers. They've rolled out 5G. They get 99.9% of what the telecoms want without impacting aviation. And happy to talk about more of the details. But the long and short of it is there are real issues, but they're addressable issues is the point. And now that we have the senior levels at the FAA, Secretary Buttigieg involved, the White House, the telecoms, and the equipment manufacturers, and the airlines. None of us were involved. Many of us weren't involved until November, didn't know about this really as being an issue until November. Once we're all involved, it's pretty easy to see how we can develop the same kind of roadmap, the same kind of clear objective criteria so that we can peacefully coexist. We can have 5G, and we can have aviation that works without massive disruptions.
How much is it curtailing your activity right now, given the agreement that was reached? How much is it curtailing your activity? I saw something with the FAA just for today, because there's bad weather in the New York area, says we may have to curtail some airlines.
Yeah, there are modest impacts that are happening right now when the weather is bad. So essentially what happens is there are some aircraft altimeters and aircraft types that get interference. The best ones are only 200 feet away before they get interference, and the worst can be a couple of miles. And so if it's a couple of miles and you have towers within that radius, then you're not allowed to fly in these Category 2, Category 3 conditions in bad weather into those airports. And so it's a relatively small number of airplanes at smaller number of airports. Some of the really catastrophic impacts, like grounding all the 777s and grounding all the 747s. Fortunately, the deal that the telecoms voluntarily, and I thank them for doing that, agreed to with the administration, with Secretary Buttigieg, prevented the really by far worst outcomes. But there are modest impacts still right now.
So finally, going beyond 5G and the issues there, Scott, one of the things I don't think perhaps we talk enough about is the infrastructure supporting the airlines. We now have a bipartisan infrastructure plan that's being rolled out. One of the issues is really air traffic controlling in the United States. Are we making the upgrades we should in order to support the airlines?
Well, I hope we will. There's a lot of that's on the table. It's taken a long time to get it implemented. We call it next-gen aviation, and it got wrapped up in whether the FAA should be privatized or not. And that should have never really been the issue. The issue is modernizing the air traffic control system. Today, if we fly from New York to Los Angeles, instead of flying in a straight line, which our GPS would allow us to do, minimizing the time, minimizing fuel burn, we fly a zigzag pattern around the country, really for highways in the sky that were set up back in the 1920s. And we still fly the same highways in the sky. That's why when you fly, you'll feel the airplane turn left and turn right and change altitudes because we're flying through those highways in the sky. And it's unnecessarily inefficient. We could cut the time, fuel efficiency, carbon emissions by, roughly 10 to 15% just by getting to next generation air traffic control. So we are hopeful that we will get there, and there's certainly more funding available in the infrastructure bill to help us get to a world like that.